Welcome to the Architectural History module in Semester 6 for Bachelors of Architecture. Today's lecture is on public art in public spaces, typologies of streets, squares, parks, etc. The essentialness of public space is a universal urban trait. Cities of every age have seen fit to make provision for open places that would promote social encounters and serve the conduct of public affairs. In the ways urban form is configured and inhabited, the bounds between public and private are far from discrete. The street and quay are primarily places of transit, capturing public life in momentary pauses from a river of people in motion. The public place, on the other hand, is a destination, a purpose-built stage for ritual and interaction. Broadly, the reference is to places we are all free to use as against the privately owned realm of houses and shops. They are themselves often defined, these public places, by the private architecture of house and shop. But the distinction of purpose holds the fact that in public places we act in ways we cannot or do not in the public realm. There are two justifying aspects to the concept of public place. One has to do with familiar and chance encounters. We go out to meet our friends, neighbors, by the town well, at the park bench, in the square in front of the church. But since everyone is entitled to make use of public spaces, we will also see in the same park or square people we do not know or do not care or associate with. The second aspect is a ritual one. Public places host structured or communal activities such as festival, riots, celebrations, public executions, and because of that, such places will bear the designed evidence of our shared record of accomplishment and our ritual behavior. They are where we choose to commemorate a costly war, for example, and for those who fell for us. The establishment of the main square itself often underscores the communal character. The fundamental aim of the public place is to ensconce community and to arbitrate social conflict. The program is a paradox. The square is where we exercise our franchise, our sense of belonging. We are meant to come and go as we please without the consent of authorities and without any declaration of a justifying purpose. There are of course specialized functions such as markets, drills, feast day ceremonies, but even there the crowd has doers and watchers. The activity is understood at some level to be collective, and participation is both random and institutionalized. In some staged communal festivals, we have a chance to hold authority to public ridicule and reassert the popular source of all political power. But these very prerogatives impelled ruling agencies early on to dominate the square. Physically, it was furnished with the symbols of government. Its space served as a setting for acts of legitimization as well as for the public display of justice. The object of government in dominating the public place is to restrict access to it and regulate behavior within it. An orderly orchestrated gathering in support of the state constitutes a proper official use of the central square. Unauthorized gatherings have to be guarded against. The formation of a crowd can be the first step to a popular challenge of authority. Even now, the public place is the canvas on which political and social changes are painted. It is not enough to take over the reins of a city, to overwhelm an existing social order and supplant it with a new one. It is important to demonstrate this change in the design and uses of the public realm within the city. Historically, the enclosure of urban gathering places was the prerogative of religious architecture. The atrium of the early Christian basilica and the san of a Muslim mosque were large urban courtyards entered through one or more gates and surrounded by covered porticos. In Islam, by and large, public space is confined to residual, interstitial areas between cells, neighborhoods, bazaars, the mosque complex. The contrast with Western urbanism, which can be said to start out with the street system and the public places, is valid as far as it goes but should not be overdrawn. There is a well-defined sense of public space in Islamic cities. Included in this concept are streets, maidans, mosques, and cemeteries. Regardless of the private use of these resources, they can never be privately owned. Every member of the society had an equal claim to the public places, be it a Muslim or non-Muslim. There was no distinct civic arena in an Islamic city because there was no municipality as such with its own charter of privileges and responsibilities. The true collective was assembled crowds of the Friday noon prayer in the main mosque. Material evidence for the assertion that main congregational mosque, the Friday mosque, and its courtyard were the true forum of Islam comes from the treatment of Roman forums by Muslim conquerors in the city that came under their dominion. The mosque was commonly placed over the forum, which ceased thereby to exist as an open space. The relation of temple courtyard to urban square can be an evolving one. To change the reference from Islam to Christianity, there is a certain ambiguity in the monastic planning regarding the accommodation of a lay public on the premises. In Italy, by later 15th century, the term cloister came to be applied to an quadrangular architectural space enclosed by arcades, whether it was a part of a religious or a secular program. An enclosed atrium-like area associated with the church was reinterpreted as piazza, emulating the ancient forum. This fusion of atrium and urban squares reoccurs in several places in Europe, with its uniform arcades that lock the church front to the sides of the square. Often starting out at the city edge, the monasteries found themselves in time well within the city limits. The preaching fields were transformed into ample squares, which also served as markets and setting for popular festivals. The state contributed to their monumental decoration, treating them as civic squares. Where within the urban form public places are deployed is often a matter of accident as it is of forethought. The persistence of open space is one factor. A large public monument of one period with an open usable space may become a public square in another period, regardless of the shifts in the urban fabric during the interim. Centrality appears to be the norm for the principal meeting ground and representational space of a city, but all too often this primary site is fixed after the fact. In the course of Synosim, the government of the nascent municipality will try to create a centralized focus for merging settlements or simply accept an open space among them as the new civic forum and equip it accordingly. The deliberate concern with the size of squares is a luxury afforded to new towns or town extensions. In towns with long history, the open spaces are likely to have been inherited from an urban former chapter or shaped improvisatorily. To size the square of the town's population means to have it to be large enough for the uses of people make of the square. This ought to be made of such size as the multitude of citizens require, and that they may not be too small for their convenience and use, or that to the small number of people they may not seem uninhabited. Since the group uses of main square will not be continuous, appropriate size is ultimately a matter of appearance. Single-purpose squares will inevitably seem uninhabited without their intended crowds. Size of the square and its architectural frame are interdependent. If the surrounding buildings are too low, the open space will appear to be too large, and if they are too high, the space would be unduly restricted. Totalitarian scales for a city square had needs of its own for mass demonstrations. The square served as the point of convergence for celebratory street processions from each of the various town districts. This meant an open space large enough to contain them all or to appear as if it could. In new cities, the grand void of the center for public merrymaking and mass demonstrations became a standard feature of planning. In old cities, a vast area of center would be cleared of buildings and turned into a composite public space to be used by the party for its scripted rituals. This was a righteous purge of the capitalist city, the destruction of its cultural core. The central issue of public places is in fact the versatility. And here the interrelation with form in the broad sense of physical structure becomes inescapable. In some, the less specific the form of the square, the more possible is it to have a public place of mixed uses. With the market apparatus kept temporary and removable, for example, the market could become the area in the evenings or of a spectacle or game of sports during the some days of the year. In the end, the main or steady uses of public places are very few. The improvised or occasional uses are quite diverse. it may be considered foolhardy to design squares for the convenience of such incidental events. These incidental events, such as festive occasions, the architectural frame of the square with its windows, balconies, and galleries made viewing room for better class of the spectators. Public buildings fronting on it were decorated to suit the moment. Bleachers and demountable grandstands leaning against palaces. Floor of the square might be flooded with water. For the rest, temporary installations transformed the daily space into a stage appropriate for the occasion, to be dismantled and removed when the spectacle was over. There is a rich visual record from the Baroque period of such stage sets in hundreds and commemorative prints and books, where the actual buildings of the square to total encasements and temporary structures were erected independent of the existing buildings. Attempts to look at squares in a comprehensive way may have been few and far in between, and they have come from the corner of the architect and architectural historian. For this reason, they have favored form over content. Rob Creer's 1975 Urban Space is an excellent analysis of urban space as systems, but is also an abstract discussion, that is typology without history. The examples come from everywhere regardless of time. Some are historic, some schematic summaries, and some propose new design. Creer formulates a typology of urban space which groups spatial forms and their derivatives into three main groups, according to the geometrical pattern of their ground plan. The groups are ordered around square, circle, and triangle. Organic and formalist squares are included in the same family, so that their highly regular triangular space in a medieval town associates classlessly, as it were, with that of Palace Dauphine in Paris, for example. And when Creer worries about the modern period, it is not because it went flat, but because of what calls the erosion of urban space, of which erosion gives a blow account from 1900 to that of 60s. Public spaces of geometrical ordered city plans and city extensions on regular design, while the organic cities will accommodate open space as they are able to in improvised fabric of their history. The prodigious variety of irregular squares can, for simple purpose of plan analysis, be seen to deviate within basic forms of geometry, and their combinations at the same time. The purest circle or square will possess visual rigor only to the degree that its building walls are uniform and its open spaces are uncluttered. A difference of another sort is also axiomatic. The shape of a medieval marketplace or a civic square has a specificity contingent upon patterns of traffic that often predate the open space and upon intricacies of process over time in the density and vigor of the confining structures. The popularity of triangular shapes, for example, can be explained through the incidence of traffic intersections of 2 or 3 roads converging upon the town centre. A Baroque square, on the other hand, is an arbitrary product, or rather, it obeys the logic of some design theory which may have considered shape a variable of formal beauty. The various shapes of square as shown here are the triangle, the trapezoidal, the rectangle, the L-shaped square, the circle and ellipse, the hemicycle. The convergence and distribution of traffic has always been for the urban square. It is obvious that needs of traffic would be at odds with the nature of the square as a gathering place. A debate over priorities can be sensed throughout history, and even when the issue is not specifically engaged. The foreign and Roman towns were close to traffic, crossroad features, as it was nonetheless placed just off the crossing of the two main axes or to one side of the main artery that stretched from the interurban high road running the length of the city. In medieval new towns of southern France, the street system was often independent of the open space of the main square, in that the streets were directed through arcaded passages which framed the ground floor of boundary buildings. A common type of square in medieval towns, shaped not by survey but by accretive growth so as to be called the turbine plaza. The English square of 17th and 18th century was exclusive on principle. In Italy, the medieval preference for the secured squares continued into Renaissance. In both periods, squares were often isolated from their surroundings by means of chain and even gates that block streets of access. A street junction brings together people as well as traffic may be self-evident, but so is the fact that social intercourse must be confined to the edges and traffic allowed to flow unimpeded through the open space. With the advent of the motor car, the idea of traffic and pedestrianization has changed. Seen here is Eugene Renard's The City of Architect of Paris proposal for Carrefour gyration, a roundabout for the automotive age from Paris, dated 1907. Open land within the city limits was not at all exceptional in antiquity and Middle Ages. Since the activities of the countryside did not stop at the city gates, fruit and vegetable gardens at the back of the house spread patches of green throughout the urban form. Commons where total cattle from the town could graze were often not much built beyond the built-up area and doubled as recreational grounds. The widespread tradition of sacred woods predated urbanization almost everywhere. When Rome became a city, the spirits were anthropomorphized and housed in temples, but the grooms remained tended and protected by religious sanctions. Also venerable is the practice of making the gardens of public buildings and the private gardens of the very rich accessible to all under certain conditions and schedules. Ancient Rome had a wealth of special gardens open to everyone. Public buildings famous for their gardens were in effect public parks that can site gardens for use of public. Naturally, much of the open space for general use lay beyond city limits. The chief practical designation were pasture lands and agricultural fields, drill grounds, and cemeteries. Public claims to air and recreation clashed with their special interest and with invasions of private ownership. The areas closest to the edge of the town, because of their accessibility to commoners without carriages, were the most bitterly contested. In England, public use of open fields and crown parks through the means of establishing customary rights or privileges was prevalent. According to a maxim of common law, enjoyment of property over a long period of time conferred a right to its continued enjoyment. In early 15th century, the city of London had easy access to fields, that is, for ease of citizens to pass upon causes into fields for their recreation. An Act of Parliament was passed in 1592. This Act and royal decrees furthered the fierce struggle to establish customary access to such fields. The princely or aristocratic tradition of providing limited public access to gardens had a long history. Royal parks or gardens of a noble villa were periodically which were established by 1700 for provisions of public promenades. The cemetery was also mentioned as a public park of sorts, especially the disfavor of churchyard burial grounds through enlightenment for reasons of health and decorum, establishment of planned extramural cemeteries. Some of the churchyards became public grounds and gardens. They were controlled by private burial boards. In city of London, in the end of 19th century, there were 362 burial grounds, of which 41 were still in use, and rest mostly closed down in the 1850s. Some 90 were public recreational grounds. The slums, congestion, disorder, ugliness, and threat of disease provoked a reaction in which sanitation improvement was first demanded post the industrial period. Efforts to improve the urban environment emerged from the recognition of the need for recreation. Parks were developed to provide visual relief and places for healthy play or relaxation. Later, playgrounds were carved out in congested areas and facilities for games and sports were established not only for children but also for adults whose work days gradually shortened. In the middle of the 19th century, Brooklyn, then a separate city, was growing rapidly. Like the neighboring New York City, then confined to just the island of Manhattan, the civic and political leaders of Brooklyn saw the desperate need for a new parkland to accommodate their growing population and offer respite from the crowded industrial cityscape. In 1859, the New York State Legislature created a commission to recommend new sites for parkland in Brooklyn. In 1860, the largest and most ambitious planned park was centered around Mount Prospect on the outskirts of the city. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Poor, the designers of the Central Park in Manhattan around the same time, were hired to landscape the new park. By the end of 1860, the land for the planned park was bought up by the city of Brooklyn. Complications arose, however, due to the outbreak of the Civil War and commercial and residential land speculation already underway in the area of the park at that time. Olmsted and Waugh's proposal was finally accepted and the park officially opened in 1867 while still under development. In 1873, financial panic caused work on the park to largely cease, scraping the more ambitious elements of the planned public space, but finally giving Brooklyn a premier public park. The street is an entity made up of a roadway, usually a pedestrian way, and flanking buildings. Each of these is articulated, and how they interact, in what ways of design of street walls is controlled and guided. These are the questions of form, pure and simple. There is a matter of sidewalks, of street furniture, of pavings of trees and greenery, each with its own, yet very incompletely known story. Street as an institution is equally critical subject. Beyond its architectural identity, every street has an economic function and social significance. The purpose of the street traditionally have been traffic, exchange of goods, and social exchange and communication. All three are inseparable related to the form of the street, the material ways in which these activities are housed and helped along. There are intricate levels of social engagement encouraged and hosted by the street structure. A number of themes remain relevant throughout the history of the street, whatever the period. One of these has to do with a variety of private challenges to the public control of the street space and corresponding public effort to preserve the integrity of the street channel and keep it free from encroachments. The key reality here is that the street remains the stage of a constant struggle between private and public interest. At the moral is that when public control falters, private abuse becomes endemic. The public good requires that the street space be kept open, accessible to all, and equipped with for all its functions. But explicitly defining an outdoor space for general use, the community makes a commitment to this principle. The private urge is to appropriate this space for one's own purposes. This is done in two ways, through encroachments and through blockages or privatization. Encroachments are incremental over time. In this instance, abutters consider the street as unoccupied ground space into which they might extend their built premises. The concern for decorous street entailed a long-term program of defining the street space within firm, continuous street walls and to the extent possible controlling the overall design of these walls. At the crux of the matter is the relation of the street line to the building line. When the two are congruent, the structure of the public space is unequivocal. As abutting buildings arbitrarily push back from the street line or protrude beyond it, an ambivalent spatial zone is created along the street channel which blurs this structure. In purely architectural terms, the ideal expression of a building as a three-dimensional artifact presumes the coordinated treatment of the four elevations. But in the making of streets, the identity of each building must submit to the overall structure beyond its limit. Generally speaking, the dignity of a freestanding object is accorded to public monuments, while ordinary fabric takes form out of more or less contiguous buildings, as if the streets were carved out of what was once a solid mass. In cultures where there is a strong sense of homestead as an individual detached unit, there will be a corresponding indifference to the formation of enclosed street spaces, that is, of streets as well-defined volumes of exterior space and corridors of movement. The only legitimacy of street is a public space. Without it, there is no city. Practical needs, access to adjacent property, passage of thorough traffic, come to mind first because they are obvious. But the fundamental reality of streets, as with all public space, is political. If the street was an invention, it is set out to designate a public domain that would take precedence over individual rights, including the right to build what wants want, where one wants, and the right to treat open space as one's front yard. The street furthermore structures community. It puts on display the workings of the city, supplies a backdrop for its common rituals. Because this is so, the private buildings that enclose the street channel are perforce endowed with a public presence. This political and communal aspect of street is best attested by popular street celebrations, which after the Renaissance in the era of princes were gradually banished or interiorized. It is precisely at moments of political transformation that the street renews its currency as a medium for ceremonial assertions of power. In modern times, this has been particularly true of societies forged through revolution. Here, the secular procession is deliberately cultivated as a mask affirmation of changed social roles and values. idea of harnessing the vitality of street theatre to the goal of revolutionary re-education. Man is nature's greatest phenomenon. The most magnificent of all spectacle is that of a large popular festival. In established totalitarian states, the temporary nature of processional street decoration clashes with the pursuit of immutable rule, carnival playfulness with the needs for sober conformity. Mass observances of political fealty are designed to strike a military chord, and power is refined permanently in monumental architecture. Another important part of streets is sidewalks and paving. Two perennial concerns with respect to the flow of traffic were the quality of street surface and the separation of vehicles from pedestrians. The sidewalk, commonsensical response to the second concern, remained exceptional until relatively recent times. The ancient world, Rome, at any rate, was certainly aware of the raised pedestrian streets along the edge of the streets. In post-Roman period, as part of the general deterioration of streetscapes, sidewalks went out of use almost entirely until their re-emergence in the modern period. The earliest reference to provision of sidewalks, or at least raised footpaths, seems to be post-fire plan of London, where he proposes to use leftover bricks for paving. In times when there were no sidewalks, distinctions were commonly made between the carriageway and the pedestrian strips. In Turkish Sofia, the streets were unpaved except on the sides where there was a pebble pavement for pedestrian. Beginning in the late 18th century, a series of improvements in street design were introduced and popularized in England. The sidewalk often provided a site with improved drainage and protection from soil compaction and injury from street trees, which until then had to struggle for survival on the edge of the roadway. Since the mid-18th century, there were private initiatives to construct foot pavements for some exclusive streets, but these consisted of uneven and unconnected limestone slabs. Main thoroughfares in Roman cities were paved with large stone blocks, and polygonal tufa pavings of the highways, familiar with the hyperbolic evocations, were also carried out through into the urban stretches across the Roman Forum. The tradition of compelling property owners to bear the cost of street paving is persistent. In Paris, the story dates back to 1184. Pavers began to appear in documents of the 14th century. The Westminster Paving Act of 1762 took any remaining responsibility for paving streets away from individuals and assigned it to commissioners empowered to tax abettors for the cost. The pedestrian's path was separated from the roadway by timber posts which defended the pedestrian from wayward carriages. Stone-paved streets in England existed in the pre-conquest times. Rubbish accumulated very fast over this cover of chalk and flint, and rain caused havoc. Cobblestone pavements proved long-lived despite the fact that they were uncomfortable to walk on. Granite blocks were ideal heavy-duty stone, durable and easy to maintain, but they were also very expensive. Brick found favor intermittently. However, wood was also a part of the venerable history as a paving material. The log pavement goes back to the Bronze Age. Wood was also widely used in America since the colonial times. Paving was protected as much as possible. Late medieval municipalities in England regularly prescribed against carters with over-heavy loads or with iron-shod cart wheels. The kind of paving were directly relevant to street cleaning. Beyond flushing drains and open gutters, the street surface had to be cleaned periodically. Many cities had regulations about this quite early in their history. Often abettors had the responsibility of cleaning the front of their property up to the middle of the street. The great turning point in street paving came with the perfection of asphalt. Made with two basic components of bitumen and aggregate like sand or stone dust, it was flexible enough to withstand shocks, impervious to water, and able to expand in warm weather. From about 1885 on, it became an all-purpose modern street cover in both Europe and United States. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your kind attention.